Well, here we are finishing up Zephaniah. Just 3 chapters, 3 sessions. That's one of the nice things about these minor prophets is really have a lot of velocity as we go through them. And it's been a great year as we've start closing in on the end now of finishing these minor prophets. So good for you for continuing in it. We are in Zephaniah 3 today. I call this the cycle continues because what we see in the prophets is a cycle of judgment. God brings a case against his people, brings judgment against his people, and then he brings hope for his people. And we see that here. This chapter begins with sorrow and ends with joy. It begins with judgment and destruction and ends with reconstruction, regeneration. It's just given a hope for tomorrow, I think, a warning for today and hope for tomorrow. So there's several sections in this. It starts out with the first 4 verses being the case against Jerusalem, and then the warning of judgment in verses 5 through 7. And then in verse 8, we see global judgment. And then the rest of the chapter is really hope for Israel's future. And if Israel has a future, so do the nations of the world. I mean, God is going to return. He's going to establish his kingdom. He's going to be dwelling among his people and bringing justice and righteousness to the earth. So let's take a look at verses 1 through 4. We see the case against Jerusalem here. Verse 1 is, I think, an overall characterization of the city of Jerusalem, but also really all of Judah at this point. There's a figure of speech you can watch for in the Bible. There's a technical term, but basically the part of something stands for the whole. In this case, the part, which is Jerusalem, stands for the whole of Judah, the whole kingdom, the whole southern kingdom. And they're characterized as being a rebellious people against God, ritually unworthy to worship him. They are cruel. They are offensive. Verses 3 and 4 list 7 specific offenses. So God is, bringing his case against Israel. He is being very specific. He is holding them accountable to his word, to his law. It begins with the first one, particularly relevant for Zephaniah. God won't listen to the prophets. We're going to see this later in the book of Acts. That is Stephen's speech before the Sanhedrin. He rehearses Israel's history, pointing out how often they've failed to listen to the prophets, failed to act in faith, failed to heed them, would not listen to the prophets, did not learn from God's chastening. Again, a good lesson for us as we look over the shoulder of what's happening in Israel, that God chastens his people, but his true people, his people who are going to stand firm, respond to the chastening, the others do not. So they didn't listen to the prophets. They didn't learn from what God was doing. They didn't trust or depend on God's promises. This is the essence of faith, isn't it? Faith is not some sort of abstract idea, some esoteric sort of definition, but faith is simply acting on the promises of God. Acting is the operative word there, the key word, moving out, acting on God's promises, not on what's going on around us, or even the danger that acting on God's promises might cause us. Faith is really acting on those promises. That's why I think later Paul's going to say that not all Israel is Israel. That is, not all Israel acted in faith. Some did not. So they did not approach God. I think the idea here is to approach him in worship, approach him in sacrifice, repenting from their sins, providing the sacrifices that they were supposed to. The civil leaders, he says, another condemnation here, are like ravenous wolves, devouring the people, taking advantage of them. Great picture there of wolves just tearing apart and eating up some defenseless animal right before God's eyes, in this case, the sheep, his people. The prophets don't care about the consequences of what they say, what they do. So as a result, They're not trustworthy. Prophets can't be trusted. Finally, the priests have ruined the sanctuary, right? They've defiled it because of the quality of worship that they lead, and they've ignored God's law. You know, God's word tells us how we're to worship him. We don't get to make it up, right? That's what the book of Leviticus is about for the Hebrew saints, the Old Testament saints. We don't get to make up how we worship God, but God tells us what's acceptable to him. Isn't this the problem from the garden with Cain and Abel? In verse 8, let's just take a look at that. We make a transition here into global scope here. He says, all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. So it's as if God is saying, what I'm doing to Israel, what I'm about to do to them, the destruction I'm going to bring on this city and this kingdom, I'm going to do this globally. Pay attention to what's happening. I'm going to do this globally. So we see this again as a kind of a prophetic telescope. We see a near-term and then a long-term fulfillment of these things. And look what he says here. He's going to gather the nations. He's going to assemble the kingdoms. He's going to pour out his indignation, vent his wrath against them. And again, the end of the verse there, for all the earth will be devoured. This is not just Israel, but this is all God's people, or all the earth. Finally, in verses 9 to 20, we kind of turn a corner here from judgment to hope, judgment to restoration. Verse 9, we say I understand this to mean the peoples of the earth their lips will be purified. Could be he's got specifically Israel in view here. I think he does in the next verse. But for sure, he's talking about there's going to be a regeneration that's going to happen. I think this is a global regeneration that's going to happen. And people are going to be worshiping him. Lips are going to be purified. They're going to call on his name. There's going to be unity to serve the Lord. Verse 10 then says that God's own people, the dispersed ones, he calls them, are going to be gathered back into the nation. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 10, where we see God's promise that he's going to regather them from a worldwide dispersion, which seems to be what's in view here as a worldwide dispersion, not just an exile to Babylon or an exile to Assyria, but a worldwide dispersion. He's going to call them back in the last days. Verses 11 through 13, then, this returning remnant is going to be purged of the unbelievers, those who are not believing the Lord, and the rest that are left will be realize rich blessings from God. That's what we see here. For more details on that, you can look in Zephaniah chapter 13, verses 8 and 9, talk about a purging that God's going to do among his returning people. And he's going to purge out of them 2/3, which will be unbelievers, unfaithful unbelievers, and 1/3, which will be the faithful believers. He will, verse 14, some great verses here. There's going to be a big party. Shouts for joy, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. I think what's happening here, my opinion, this is my opinion. It's not, can't go to chapter and verse, but if you look at Revelation chapter 19, the description of the marriage supper of the Lamb, of course the Lamb is there, the church is being brought together, but there's others that are invited. I think those are the Old Testament saints, the purged of Israel, are present and witnessing this marriage supper of the Lamb in the last days, and that's what we see here is this great rejoicing, this great, that's going to reverberate throughout Jerusalem. Verse 15 then through 17, we see the Lord finally among his people. The Lord has always promised to be among them physically, and what we see here is God's present with them. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. The people are gathered to him. In that day it will be said to Jerusalem, don't be afraid. Don't let your hands fall limp. The Lord is in your midst. Remember what I said last time about repetition. He's a warrior. Look at this. He's going to exalt over you in joy. He will be quiet in his love. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. God's singing over his people. He's singing over his bride, the church. He's singing over his regathered people, Israel. This is a party in heaven, right? A party on earth as well. And then this is followed by, in 18 through 20, just this repetition. Remember what I said about repetition? This is the way that they highlight things in biblical writers. He repeats 8 different things that God's going to do here. I will gather. I will deal with your oppressors. I will save. Again, I will gather. I will turn their shame to praise. I will bring. I will give. I will restore. What great promises for the future. Should give us hope for today. Promises for the future. Give us an anchor today, brothers and sisters, for our soul. And don't we need an anchor today for our soul as we see so many terrible things happening in the world? We could be easily tossed back and forth by every wind of doctrine that might explain what's happening, whatever heresy would come up, whatever popular opinion, how quickly we could be tossed back and forth if we didn't have this anchor of hope in the future that God has given us. We are looking forward to the return of the Lord, the vindication of his people, and his reward for the faithful. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Be certain, be confident, live as if you have an anchor stabilizing your soul. God bless you.